Hi, I'm Chad with Move for Guitar. This lesson is from our series Music Theory for Guitar. In this lesson, I'm going to talk about key modulation. First off, if you like the diagrams for everything in this series, including the diagrams for this lesson, you can download our free e-guide, Music Theory for Guitar. And this e-guide will be something that you can study and use as a reference for years to come. And like I said, it's free, so there's no reason not to just go download it. This is part 4.21 from our series Music Theory for Guitar. If you'd like to go back and start at the beginning, you can click the link on the screen. So this is the last lesson before we dive into the new section, and in the new section I'm going to talk about modes of the major scale, but I think this is important to touch on now. And again, this is something that I'm going to dive deeper into when I create my series Music Theory for Songwriting, but it is important to at least touch on so you can have the basics of it. But it is a deep subject, so I'm not diving too deep into it right now. We'll do that later on. And in the last few lessons we've been talking about taking a chord progression that's in one key and then using chords that are outside of the key. And when we were doing that, we weren't changing keys really. We were still basing it around one key. For example, if we were in the key of C, we might have used chords from the parallel minor key from C minor, or a subdominant or a secondary dominant chord, or a chord from outside the key, but still it was really based around C major. We never changed keys when we were doing that. This lesson is about how to start in one key and then actually change to another key. And that's why I talked about chord families in the last lesson. And you'll remember that I mentioned the main chord families are your tonic, your subdominant, and your dominant. And those are the 1, 4, 5 chords, but the rest of the chords fit within those families. So the 2 chord can fit with the 4 chord and so on. And you can change them out. It's called diatonic reharmonization, where you just take a chord that's in the same family and then replace it for each other. And the reason that was so important is because I said using those 3 chord families firmly established a key. So if you used a chord from the tonic, a chord from the subdominant, and a chord from the dominant, you firmly established what key you're in. Or if you use an authentic cadence, which is a 5 to a 1, you're firmly establishing the key as well. And the reason we're talking about firmly establishing a key is because you need to firmly establish a key before you can modulate to another key. And using those chord families in an authentic cadence are the technical way to do it, but you can create a key just making it feel like a chord is the tonic. If you really make a chord feel like the tonic, you've established a key, and then you can change to another key and make the new chord sound like a tonic. But in this lesson, I'm talking about the easiest way to do it, which is to use chords from each chord family and use an authentic cadence that's really going to firmly establish a key. And there's multiple reasons to modulate a song, but the main reasons are to add more harmonic movement and interest than what you can create in just one key, or to increase the intensity or lift of a song and create a more forward propulsion of a song. So it can be a really dynamic way to take the song up to another level, especially if you're, for example, just repeating a chorus over and over. If you then all of a sudden change to a key, a higher key, it's going to really create a lift and create more intensity and energy. And that's something you'll run into a lot with songs is, for example, a chorus can be repeated over and over again, and then all of a sudden it raises the key and plays the same chord types as far as like a 1, 2, 3, 4, major, minor. It plays the same chord types in the same order, but then you're in a higher key, so it really creates more energy and a lift to the song. Or it can be done before a bridge of a song. It can be done going into the bridge. A bridge can be in another key, and that can really create more energy or more dynamics or more interest as well. Or another reason to modulate is if you have 2 songs that you want to smoothly transition from one to the next, you need to modulate. If those 2 songs are in different keys, you need to modulate to the new song. You need to modulate keys to the new song. And this is done a lot in church music. When you listen to a church set, a lot of times they'll want to play songs smoothly from one song to the next without stopping in between. And if those songs are in different keys, someone who knows what they're doing will modulate to the new key so that it has a nice smooth transition. And there's many ways to modulate, but the three main ways are direct, parallel, and pivot chord, and that's what we're going to talk about in this lesson. And direct modulation means that without any preparation, you're just jumping into a new key. So it's a very drastic change, and it's very easy to hear because it just happens all of a sudden, and it's kind of jarring, but it can have really good effect if you do it correctly. So for example, a direct modulation, if you're in the key of C and you played a 1-5-4, you could all of a sudden just jump to the key of D and play a 1-5-4. So in the key of C, a 1-5-4 is a C major, D major, F major. You could be playing that over and over again, and then all of a sudden just jump into the key of D and play a 1-5-4 in the key of D, which is D major, A major, G major. So that's a direct modulation. It's very drastic and it's very obvious, but it can have good effect if you do it in the right situation. Another type of modulation is parallel modulation, which we talked about using chords from parallel key. But when we were talking about that in the other lesson, we were just talking about borrowing a chord or chords from parallel keys and just using it when really staying in one key. So for example, if you're in the key of C major, we borrowed chords from the key of C minor, but we didn't really change keys. When we're talking about parallel modulation, we're actually talking about taking chords from the parallel key but changing the key when we do it. So if we take chords, if we start in C major, take chords from C minor, we're actually going to establish the key of C minor and stay in the key of C minor at least long enough to establish it, and then we've actually changed keys to the parallel key. And a parallel modulation is very smooth because you're dealing with the same root. So for example, if you're in the key of C major, you're just going from C major to C minor, and it can be a very smooth transition if you do it properly. So here's an example. If you're in the key of C and we played a 1-5-4 in the key of C, which is C, G, F, then if we wanted to go into C minor, we could turn that F into a F minor, which then becomes the 4 of the key of C minor, and then we could play something like C minor, E flat major, A flat major, B flat major, which are all from the key of C minor, and then we firmly established that we're in the key of C minor now. We didn't just borrow chords from the key of C minor and stay in the key of C major. We've actually modulated to the key of C minor. Or one of the most common ways to do it, and one of the smoothest ways to do it, is using something called a pivot chord. And using a pivot chord is when you take a chord that's common to both keys and use that to pivot into the new key. For example, if we were in the key of C and we had a chord progression that was C, G, F, E minor, well that's a 1-5-4-3 in the key of C, but we're going to the key of D, that E minor is also the 2 chord in the key of D, so we've used this as our pivot chord to go to D. And the easiest way to do that is when we hit that pivot chord, the next chord would be to use the 5 of the new key, which in the key of D is A. Especially if we use the 5-7, that would really draw us to the 1 chord of the new key, and this is an authentic cadence, which really helps establish that we're in the new key of D. And then you could repeat the 5 and the 4, which really establishes the key of D. Because as you'll remember from the previous lesson, the 1, 5, and 4 are your main chord families, and that's going to really establish a key. And using a pivot chord is easy transition, but you have to do it when you're using a closely related key, meaning it needs to be a key that shares a chord with the key you're coming from. So for example, in the key of C, this E minor is the 3 chord in the key of C, but it's also the 2 chord in the key of D. So the key of D is a closely related key to the key of C because they have chords that are common to each other. Or we could go to the key of G from the key of C. Those have chords that are common to each key, so they're closely related keys, and it'd be easy to pivot to the key of G. But if you're pivoting to a distant or remote key, meaning that there's no shared chords in either key, that's a lot harder, and we're not going to talk about that in this lesson because it's pretty deep theory to actually be able to understand it, and we'll talk about that when we're talking about music theory for songwriting. When I do the course music theory for songwriting, we'll really dive into stuff like that. But that's a really advanced topic, and it's not really that common unless you're really getting more advanced in your songwriting and composing. But changing keys to closed keys with pivot chords is a very common thing to do and an easy thing to do if you just use a chord that's common to both keys, and then especially if you use an authentic cadence to go into the next chord. If you use the 5 of the new key, that's really going to help establish the new key and make a smooth transition. So just to review, the easiest ways to modulate keys are with direct, which is drastic, there's no preparation, you just jump into a new key, but it can be used with good effect if you do it properly with the proper situation. Parallel, which is transitioning to the parallel key, which can be done really smoothly and sound really good. And pivot chord, which is using a common chord from both keys, and that can be really smooth as well. And also when you're modulating keys, you really want to establish each key before you modulate. Otherwise, it's really hard to tell that you've actually modulated a key, and maybe you haven't modulated, maybe you've just borrowed chords or used chords from outside the key. And to really establish the key, the easiest way to do it is to use a tonic, a subdominant, and a dominant chord, a chord from one of those chord families or from each of those chord families. So if you're in the key of C, you'd use a chord from each of those chord families to really establish that you're in the key of C. And then when you jump to the new key, you'd use a chord from each of those chord families to establish a new key. Or to really establish it, you'd use an authentic cadence, which is a 5 to a 1, which is going to really establish a new key. But like I said, that's a technical way to really do it, but you don't have to really be that technical. Just as long as you can make the tonic of the key you're in, if we're in the key of C, the tonic C, as long as you can make that C sound like home base and the key, that's all you need to do. And there's ways to do it other than getting so technical as using each of the chord families or using authentic cadences. And you just really have to use your ear to be able to do that. So that's a little bit about key modulation. Like I said, we're going to really dive into this and dive deeper into ways to do it and get into further away keys and much more in our series, Music Theory for Songwriting. But it is important, I think, to have touched on it right now because it's a big part of songwriting and being able to understand what's going on when you're writing songs or understand what's going on when you're learning someone else's song. So like I said, this is the last lesson in this section. Go ahead and move on to the next section where I'm going to talk about the modes of the major scale, which is a really important subject, and I'm sure you've heard that term before. So if you're unsure about the modes or a little shaky on the modes, it's definitely worth diving into that new section. You're going to get a lot of good information out of it and take your playing and understanding to the next level. So definitely move on to that section and be sure to download the e-guide. All the diagrams are in there, and be sure to subscribe because we add at least one new lesson every day.